This video has been sponsored by Moog. I want to start by saying that there are two main selling points for these moogerfooger plugins. And the first one would be the sound. You see, they can sound extremely good, especially if you're looking for that old school Moog analog sound. Now, the second selling point for the moogerfooger effect suite is modulation. And that is something that these plugins do really well because they were all designed to be modular effects. And modular is good because it allows you to take something basic and expand it and do more. And the way that Moog has solved it in here is really nice because every moogerfooger effect you load in a project gets detected by all of the other moogerfoogers, and their modulation outputs get collected in a list. So you don't have to really understand anything about control voltages or how to wire these things. All you need to do is to tick check marks in a list. So what you'll have access to are LFOs and envelope follower signals. And then on top of this, you can also use the AUV3 multi-IO routing to bring in audio signals into a moogerfooger and set up amplitude or AM modulation, as it's also called, for modulating various elements inside a plugin. And not only that, these are the Moog people, and the Moog people are synth nerds. So in many cases, they've given the user the ability to switch a unipolar movement over to a bipolar movement. This is important, especially for synth nerds, and I'm so grateful for that. So yeah, what makes the moogerfoogers so special to me is the modular environment when you're working with these plugins and their great sound. The first thing I want to highlight is how Moog has solved the problem of finding the right instance of something in the modulation list, because it can get full very quickly, especially if you've got a lot of moogerfoogers loaded in your project. And it gets even worse when you're using several instances of the same plugin. Take this project, for instance. Here I have 5 instances of MuRF, and this instance of MuRF, now I want to use the signal from that to modulate the cutoff in this 101 filter. So how do I find it in the list? Well, by checking the label of that instance. So if we open up the CV modulation panel, we can find that label right here. Now, this is a randomly generated letter sequence, and it will differ between projects. Every time you load a new moogerfooger, a new randomly generated letter sequence becomes the label for the unit. Well, in this case, it's this sequence. And if we check that against the list, we can find the instance we're looking for. And now we just have to tick that box and we're good to go. Right, so basic navigation. Now in the middle, you will find all of the controls related to the plugin you've loaded. And then underneath those controls, you will find stomp box switches. Sometimes these are on-off switches, bypass switches, and in some cases, they're syncing switches for time-dependent effects and or modulators like LFOs. Now, you will find more hidden controls inside the CV modulation panel, which will be closed in default mode when you open up a moogerfooger for the first time. But if you tap the top of the plugin, it will open up. Well, you also have an open close button right here where it says CV. So if you just tap it, you can open and close this panel. Now, with this panel open, if we tap one of the input ports, we can see a list of all of these sources we have available for modulating stuff. At the top, we can see that none is tapped in right now, and that is because we have no modulation set up. Well, we also have bipolar, DC, sidechain for inputting audio through AUV3 multi-IO, and I'll show you more about that later on. Then we can find the instances of moogerfoogers we've got loaded in the project and whatever modulation outputs they have. Now, if we check the utmost top of the moogerfooger, we can find the preset list. And there is a feature in here that is pretty nice, and it gives you the ability to actually load a preset, tweak the preset, and then A/B the tweaked versus the initial preset state. So if we load a preset here, I tweak a few knobs, and then I press this thing, I can go back and forth between the initial preset state and the tweaks that I made to hear the difference. Now, there's one more thing I want to highlight, and it has to do with the internal settings of the moogerfoogers, and you can find those if you press the cogwheel icon. Now, in here you will find a varying amount of things that you can change, and it really differs depending on which moogerfooger you're looking at. Sometimes you'll be able to change an effect from mono to stereo and back again. In some cases you can change curves of envelopes, and in others you can change LFOs from unipolar to bipolar. Well, there are also instances where you can change out some algorithms, so you can have a delay sounding modern or analog or legacy. And I very often, whenever I find an analog option, will switch over to that. And here I want to support the underdog a little bit. You see, most people want stereo effects, and yeah, you can switch these over to work in stereo, and that's cool and all, but you're missing out a little bit, especially if you're working with stuff like the moogerfooger phaser or moogerfooger cluster flux. Try using them on bass and or vocals and in mono mode. You'll hear what I mean. There's just this creaminess that comes out of them that you're not going to get it with stereo. So it's time to meet the foogers, and the first one I want to bring out is the MF-109 Saturator. This is the newest plugin, and it has never existed as a hardware plugin. It turns out that during beta testing of the other moogerfooger plugins, a lot of users said they also wanted some dynamic control over the drive stages inside all of the moogerfoogers. But instead of just messing with the moogerfooger formula, they made a new plugin, which is MF-109 Saturator. And let me tell you, it is my most favorite plugin. I absolutely love the out of this one. So if we look at the interface, we can see that you're controlling the drive with an envelope follower. You got an amount control, a follow rate control, and a sensitivity control. And on the other side, there is also a noise section, which can be used for adding noise into the audio stream. And this is interesting because you've got both white and red noise. However, you can still filter off the noise with the tone control. It basically works like a low-pass filter. However, if we open up the settings menu, we can actually set the tone control over to a bandpass filtering mode, or a notch mode, or a high pass mode. Another thing to note here is also that the envelope can be set to stereo mode operation. In mono, it basically does the same thing with the drive on both left and right channels at the same time. In stereo, however, it is doing it depending on the audio information on each channel. And here I want to highlight something, because Moog actually did some thinking, and if we open up the modulation panel, it turns out that you can modulate both the drive envelope and the noise envelope independently. Well, the next pedal we're going to look at is the MF-104 Delay. And the reason to why I love this one so much is because of how analog it sounds. It is incredible. If you've been watching my channel for a while, you know that this is the case. You've seen me build them. And for those of you who hasn't seen that, well, to me, that is the most yummiest sounds in the world, better than sliced pineapple pizza. And you know what? The MF-104 can also sound like this. But the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna open up settings, and then we're gonna go down to tone, change it to analog, go to timing, change it to loose, and we're gonna go all the way down to feedback mode and switch it over to legacy. And even though it's not gonna do much for us unless we actually put the pedal in bypass mode, we're still gonna switch it over from normal to spillover, because I just want the pedal to have that old school analog behavior.
Oh God, I love this thing.
There's nothing I like more than old school dub, and to get that old school sound, I just add a moogerfooger delay pedal. It's the way that it kind of fades away in the feedback chain. It's just great. And when you put it on vocals, boy, yo, yo, yo. This is the moogerfooger dub. Now, you might not be into a really old school sound, and maybe you want something more contemporary. Well, in that case, just go into settings and set the type to ping pong, tone to modern, timing to strict, and then feedback mode to modern, and there you go. It now has a more contemporary sound to it. Looking at the interface, it's pretty straightforward. We got delay controls here on the left and also LFO controls on the right. But there are a few things I want to highlight. If you zoom in on the LFO here, you can see that there's a sample and hold waveform. And I suggest you play around with that when you're modulating the delay time, especially when increasing the amount to very high levels. It can produce some very interesting results. Now, you can also sync the LFO rate and delay time to tempo with these stomp box switches down here. And lastly, I have a quick note about the switch here for short and long delay times. Even if you do switch it over to short, you still won't be able to produce flangers and choruses with this pedal. No, for that, we're gonna have a look at another pedal next. So the MF-108 cluster flux is basically what you get when you take the MF-104 and you set it to really short delay times. You see, when you're working within milliseconds, you're able to produce flangers, choruses, and in some cases vibratos. Now this one has been set for flangers and choruses specifically. So the interface is pretty much the same, almost one-to-one with the 104. The 108 sounds absolutely amazing, and once again there are some hidden powers in the settings menu. If we go in here, we can see that we can switch the type from echo to ping pong. This drastically changes the sound. Not only that, if we go all the way down here to out of phase, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna set it to all in phase and just check this out. Personally, I love using this effect on vocals and also on synthesizers when I'm doing strings or maybe pads and things like that.
All right, so let's do something unconventional. I'm gonna set the cluster flux up to sound kind of like a metallic reverb. Got the mix up halfway, no modulation, feedback going all the way up, almost to infinite, and you can already hear it. And we can set the room size with this knob here. We can also modulate it if we wanted to, but I'm not gonna. And if we wanted this to sound mono, go in here, switch it to all in phase, and now it's mono. I'm gonna switch it back, bring the feedback down, and we can also use it kind of like a ring modulator, kind of. So bring the feedback up, and then we're gonna bring the modulation amount really, really high and rate up very, very high. And there we go.
Now, for bass sounds and drum sounds and other sounds, well, in those cases, I really love using phaser effects. And there is a great phaser in the moogerfooger lineup. Now, the MF-103 phaser has two modes. It's got a 6-stage phaser and a 12-stage phaser, and they sound very different from one another.
I know I said I use phasers for bass and stuff like that, but let me show you something cool you can do with vocals first.
Now, there are so many ways you can use a phaser, and I want to show you a way that is less conventional, probably a way that less people think of first when they hear the word phaser. Because if you turn this on right now, we can hear a normal phaser movement. And what's so cool with this one is that we're basically working with two different stages. So 6-stage, and if I turn it over to 12, we're gonna get a more richer, fuller, deeper phaser. It's gonna sound very different from the 6-stage, and that's because we now have more peaks in our comb filter. So I want to show you something really cool, because we can turn something like this into something sounding more like weird percussions, almost like congas or something. And we do that by just steepening the filters in the comb filters here. So we're going to use the 12-stage because we have many peaks in here now. And so we're going to pull up the resonance and listen to this. And I'm going to increase the rate.
you just love this stuff?
I have a love-hate relationship with phasers, especially when using them on bass, because I love using them on bass. The problem, though, is that when you're using phasers, where it's using comb filtering, well, it can enhance frequencies way too much. And whenever a phaser is moving down into the low frequency range, well, it can really overpower your mix with bass and kill everything. So what I then do is I create two tracks with the same bass. On one of them, I'm filtering off all of the top information, and I'll keep that as my sub bass track. And this will support the other track where I will then filter off the low information. So there's no sub bass in there. And then I put the phaser on top of that track. And that way I can have my phased bass without having my mix being overpowered by too much bass. Now, one thing I want to highlight here is that if you go into settings and you check here in LFO type, you can set it from mono to stereo. Now, if you keep the output mode in main and set it to stereo, you can actually have a stereo phaser effect. I always use this pedal in mono, but sometimes when working with vocals or synth sounds, I'll set it to stereo, and that can create some pretty cool effects. Now, you also have a few other output modes here, like main aux and aux main.
Alright, so if we test this, we have the output mode set to main and LFO type set to mono. If I set it to stereo, we can hear the LFO move the phaser back and forth between left and right channels. Now, if I switch it back to mono and choose main and aux, we can hear the phaser on the left side. And if we do aux and main, we can hear the phaser on the right side. At least I think that's what's going on. And even if we switch the LFO to stereo, we're not hearing that back and forth movement. For that, we have to go back to main as output mode.
Now, the interface is pretty straightforward. You got the LFO controls on the left and the phaser controls on the right. But one thing I do want to highlight is the low-high control for the LFO rate. You see, if you switch it over to high and you tweak the rate up to the maximum, then you can get some very weird frequency stuff coming out of it. And if you're into that sort of stuff, then, well, I think this is a great segue to the next moogerfooger. Now, the MF-102 ring modulator is an effect that I just cannot stay away from when dealing with voices, because it does cool things to your voice. And I'm not the first one to think that. If you've ever watched the series Doctor Who and you've heard the Daleks, well, that's how they made the voice for the Daleks, with a ring modulator.
And as you can hear, I sound kind of like a Dalek, less British and less angry, but still a Dalek voice. And then
you can bring it up here. And I absolutely love these types of voices.
Now, you can of course use a ring modulator on a synthesizer, on a guitar, on a drum track to create all kinds of interesting effects, but it's so much fun using it on vocals, like when you want to make some dark techno.
I am the one. I am the end.
One thing I'd like to note here is that I like using these pedals in mono mode, and I'm doing it right here again with the ring modulator. But you can get a stereo effect from it if you go into settings and you set the carrier type to either stereo or panning. Now, the interface is pretty straightforward. Modulator controls on the right and LFO controls on the left. And I haven't really done much with the LFO, but let me just show you something here. Next up, we're having a look at the MF-107 Freqbox. This one is quite insane and so much fun to work with, so rewarding to work with because it can do so many things. It is an oscillator that can be amplitude modulated and frequency modulated. On top of that, it can also be synced, and when you sync it and you set up the pedal just right, you can actually turn it into a distortion pedal.
All right, so here is how I set up my crazy distortion. I've got the VCO synced and I've got the VCO frequency turned up to 6. I'm also using a square waveform, which is kind of important for the type of sound I want. I'm using a very high amount of envelope control, so it's an effect kind of hard to control with your voice because it controls the frequency of the VCO and the volume at the same time. No FM modulation and mix up to full. So I'm gonna turn the volume down now on the mixer here because it's gonna get loud.
Yeah, the result can be quite harsh, but it sounds really cool. I love this thing. Now, it doesn't have to sound harsh. You can also use it as an auto synth, which is way more pleasant. Like in this project here. Here, I'm running my voice through 4 instances of Freqbox, and then I'm just having them produce sawtooth waveforms at higher and higher octaves. So basically, they're all creating this 4-octave chord. I'm then running that through a 101 filter, which is envelope controlled. It's set up in a default mode, so the softer I speak, the more filtered the sound is, and the louder I speak, the less filtered the sound is. Now, on top of this, I'm also running a vocal channel in parallel, which is going through a 102 ring modulator and a 104 delay. And then I'm just playing around with the ring modulator while I have a beat playing in the background from Roismacher Noir. So the interface is pretty straightforward. For the oscillator, you can control the frequency, you can sync it. You also have the waveforms, triangle, sawtooth waveform, and square with a pulse control. Then on the other side, we've got the envelope follower amount, we've got an FM amount, and also the mix knob. Now, when it comes to the envelope, however, if we go into the settings menu, you can see that right now it's set to control both frequency and level. And if you do switch this over to frequency only, just be careful with your volume, because when you're not controlling the level also, it will just put out the oscillator at full blast. So yeah, turn down the volume before you switch this over. If you ever wanted a classical Bob Moog filter in your mix, then this is it. It sounds great. You got the cutoff over here, you got the switch from 2 to 4 poles over here, and then a resonance knob. And the way that this works is very straightforward. You got an envelope follower in here, and then you set the amount for the envelope follower with this knob here. When you do it in positive values, you're making the cutoff open up when loud spikes of audio hits it. And when you run it the other way in negative values, it will close the cutoff instead. You got a sensitivity switch here in the form of a rate control, and then you've got a mix knob. one thing to note here is that right now I'm running this in mono, but if we go into settings, we can see that under envelope, we have both mono and stereo. In mono, the envelope is doing the same thing for the filter cutoff on both left and right channels. And if we set it to stereo, however, then it will listen to the information on both these channels and run the envelope on the cutoff accordingly. So you're getting a stereo action. So the last officially released moogerfooger is the 105 MuRF, and I say officially released because there is a missing moogerfooger, the 106TC. And you know what? I did my research on it and I discovered something that no one has discovered up to date. So just stick with me and you'll hear about it later on. So what is the MuRF? Well, look at it like this. 8 resonant filters that can be played in a sequence, in a pattern. And the best thing about it, you can edit these patterns yourself. All right, so if we zoom in on the interface, we can see that it says filters down here. And here we have 8 sliders or faders, depending on what you want to call it. And on top of them, we can see a row of numbers. And there's 2 sets of them because the effect can work in 2 different modes. One of them suitable for bass, the other one suitable for mid frequencies. One note to make here is that you want to work with material with a lot of harmonics in it, because if you're already working with an already heavily filtered sound, this thing is not going to do much for you. No, you want the MuRF to do the filtering for you. So to show you how this works, I'm using the help of a function generator plugin. It's Autisper's Augen X. It's just that, a function generator. I just wanted to produce some random notes with a sawtooth waveform because sawtooth waveforms are perfect for doing subtractive synthesis. There's a lot of harmonics in them. Okay, so this sequence is going to run through the MuRF, and then we're going to use MuRF to do some sequenced or patternized filtering. So firstly, I've done some basic settings. I've turned the mix up to 10 so we can only hear the MuRF or the signal coming through the MuRF fully. I've got the drive turned up just a little bit because I like it when it gets creamy. And then I've made sure to turn the LFO off, and we've got the frequency range set to mids. Now I'm going to turn the envelope down pretty low, and then I'm going to make sure that the rate of the sequence isn't too fast. Next, what's important here is that as long as you've got the pattern set to 1, there is no sequencing happening. You're just hearing the MuRF filters as they are. But as soon as you turn it over to one of these other numbers here from 2 to 12, that's when we start getting sequences. And they all contain different sequences, and you can edit all of these sequences and make your own. So I'm going to turn it over to 2, and then I'm going to keep all of the volumes or levels of the filters at maximum so we can hear all of them fully. And then we're going to go into settings where we have the pattern generator. Now we can already hear a filtering going on here. Now what I want to do is to clear this pattern by pressing clear pattern, and now we can work with an empty slate. So I basically want to do like a 4 on the floor beat because I think it's easier for anyone who doesn't understand this quite yet to understand what's going on here. So I'm going to be using the lower frequency filters here for our bass drum, basically 200 Hertz and 300 Hertz. So I'm going to put in nodes on 1 and 5, and we got a basic bass drum beat. Now we need a snare, and we put that on 5, but we need a bottom for the snare at 675 and a top for the snare at 1.5K. So now we have a bass drum and a snare drum. And then we're going to add a hi-hat with the highest frequency filter, 3.4K, and we're going to put that on 3 and 7. And there you go, a 4 on the floor beat. So what's happening here is that the sequencer is reading these nodes, and whenever it hits a node, it opens and closes the filter. And the way that it opens and closes can be controlled with the envelope knob. Now the fun only starts here, because then you can also bring modulation into this, because the filters in here can be swept, and you can do that with modulation. So on to modulation section now. Starting out with some basics, I made an overview so I could show you exactly what type of modulation signals that these moogerfoogers put out and which one does what. So we got LFO, envelope, sequencer phase, carrier, oscillator, and noise. And many of these are specific to certain moogerfoogers, like the noise one, it's being outputted by the MF Saturator that can also output its envelope signal. Now, the oscillator here is outputted by the frequency box, and the carrier here is being output by the 102 ring mod. And then we got the sequencer phase being outputted by MuRF. So what are these signals? Well, if we start with the LFO, it looks like this. And it actually can work in two ways in the moogerfoogers. It can be either unipolar or bipolar. The differences between those are basically this. So unipolar works within the range of one pole, and if we apply this to the knob, it looks like this. Now, the bipolar one works within the range of 2 poles, and so it makes a larger movement within the same amount of time if you have them set at the same rate, and it's very different from a unipolar movement. Now, the envelope, what is that then? Well, these plugins are all dynamically controlled. What does that mean? Well, dynamic control basically means it's listening to an audio signal following the amplitude rise and falls in the audio stream, and then it uses that to create a signal with something like an envelope follower, and then that creates the output signal. So this can fluctuate like crazy depending on the audio you're inputting into it. One thing to note here though is that this signal is being produced by an envelope follower, meaning you often have ways of smoothing this whole motion out, so you can decide how fast it rises and how quickly it falls. And that's why, for instance, in the 101, you have a setting here from slow to fast. Not only that, if you go into settings, you can see that there are actually options for this envelope, where the response can be set from an exponential response to a smooth response, and it has to do with the curving of the envelope. Now, the sequencer phase, it's outputted by MuRF, and it basically creates like a reversed sawtooth waveform, because it's linearly just rising and rising from the first step to the last step until it starts over again. So yeah, it's creating a sawtooth waveform. And here, what's interesting is that if you draw in very long patterns, it will take a long time for the sequencer to go through the steps, depending on your rate, of course, but yeah. So what about the carrier? Well, the carrier is outputted by the ring modulator, and you can think of it as an oscillator, but with an LFO function. So if you bring it down to low frequencies, switch it over to low and bring it down, and you use the signal, you're gonna realize it works like an LFO. But you can also bring it up to high speeds, where it becomes more like an oscillator, because you're going into the audible rates. And this brings us to the oscillator, because it basically is like an LFO at very high rates. That's the biggest difference between an LFO and an oscillator. They just work at different rates. The last type is noise, and it basically puts out a randomly fluctuating modulation signal that behaves just like noise, because that's what it is. Now, there is one type of signal left that you can use, because all of these moogerfoogers have support for AUV3 multi-IO, and I'm talking about an input, basically like a sidechain, only this one is used to take an audio signal and use that as an amplitude modulation signal. So the resulting signal can vary wildly depending on what type of audio you're sending into it. It's almost like combining an oscillator signal with a noise signal and then having that vary in amplitude. In the end, it's an unpredictable, very unstable, hard to control type of signal, and that's why it's so very interesting. And I'm going to show you some tips and tricks in the next segment where we actually start combining moogerfoogers and set up some modulations. I'm gonna suck on your face. Yes. Ooh, suck on that face. I'm gonna suck on your face. I'm gonna suck on that face. Ooh, suck on your face. Suck on your face. I'm gonna suck on your face. So we're going to start by doing some amplitude modulation through the sidechain input. Now here we have an instance of Hilda. And it's running through the MF-101 filter. Over here we have an instance of Hammerhead, which is playing a drum track. And we're gonna use the audio from the drum track to modulate the filter cutoff in the MF-101 filter. Now to do this, we need to use the sidechain input for the modulation. So first, we need to go to the channel with the drum track on it, and we're gonna open this up and go to multibus audio unit instances. Now here we need to find the MF-101 filter, and it's all the way down here in the list. We select that, and now the audio from the drum track can go into the MF-101 filter. But we also need to set up some modulation in here. So we're gonna go to the cutoff knob, and then we're gonna choose one of the channels here for the sidechain. So it doesn't really matter which one we take because both channels look pretty much the same. So I'm just gonna select the left channel. And now when I play this, what we get is... which is pretty nice. And right now the movement of it is bipolar, but this can actually be turned into a unipolar movement if we go into the modulation settings for the cutoff knob. And well, here it's gonna be weird because we're actually gonna select bipolar, but in doing so, we're actually turning it unipolar. Yeah, there are some instances where this isn't very straightforward inside the moogerfoogers. But yeah, I'm gonna select this, and now when I play it, you're gonna see a unipolar movement of the cutoff knob instead. All right, so when it comes to LFOs, carrier outputs, and oscillator, they all do kind of the same thing. They swing up and down between poles at different rates. Oscillators at high speeds, LFOs at low speeds, and carrier outputs, in this case with the ring modulator, well, it has two speeds. It can run at high oscillator speeds and low LFO speeds. So what we're gonna do is use that to modulate the phaser sweeping in the phaser. So right now we have spacecraft loaded here. And as you heard there, I was sweeping the filter and I was doing it manually with my finger. Now, if we wanted to do it automatically, we could add the internal LFO. But no matter how we do it, it's gonna move at the same speed, at the same strength, depending on how we set it up, of course. But yeah, and to me, it feels boring. So in order to fix that, what I often do is I cross-modulate speeds of LFOs. That way I get weird LFO outputs. And in the ring modulator, we have a carrier output that can be used as an LFO. So first, we're gonna set that up for the rate of the LFO inside the phaser. So we go to the rate of the phaser, we go in here in this list and we find the carrier output from the MF-102 ring modulator. We select that, and as you can see right now it looks like there's nothing happening, but if you look closely you can see it's kind of blinking, and that's because it's running at a very high speed. So we're gonna bring that down with the frequency knob here until we get to low speeds, and we can also switch it over to low where we have LFO speeds, and now it looks more like an LFO. Now, what we need to do is to make this change so it doesn't do that same movement. And so we go back to the ring modulator, we increase the LFO amount to full,
We bring down the speed a little bit, we switch it over to sine wave, and now if we look at the movement here, we can see that it's doing something weird. It's moving kind of fast and then slow and then fast and then slow. Now, what's so nice about this is if you have other moogerfooger pedals, for instance, like the MF-104 Delay, it has an LFO output with many more types of waveforms. Well, you see where it can go. It gets very interesting. Be creative with this. All right, so for the envelope modulation tutorial, I want to show you how to texturize something with something else. Once again, I'm going to use a synth that I'm playing through a phaser, and then we're going to modulate the phaser with the resulting signal of an envelope coming from the saturator. Now, to activate that envelope, I'm using Hammerhead to run a drum track through it. I'm gonna put a 4 on the floor beat in here, and that's gonna activate the envelope, and we can see the activation of the envelope here from the LED. So we're gonna go into the phaser, and we have the second stage or the 12 stage on, meaning we now have 2 modulation in ports for sweeping the filter. You see here sweep 1 and 2, and when you've got it activated to the 12 stage mode, you got the first set of 6 stages, and then you've got the second set of 6 stages. So in sweep 2, we are going to look for the saturator envelope output, which is right here. And as you can see, we are now getting that 4 on the floor activation from the envelope and the drum machine going through it. And we're gonna increase this to maximum. And what we now end up with is this. And if we change the pattern in here, we can now get a different texture coming from it. All right, so the MuRF can output a sequencer phase, which basically works like a reversed sawtooth waveform. And we're going to use it to sweep the filters inside the MuRF itself. And then I'm going to show you how to use the LFO in here with the help of a DC signal. So what we're going to do first is I'm going to just show you what I've got working here. So it's just Augen X generating some randomly generated notes again, together with some noise. And we're gonna use this to send it through the MuRF, which already has a sequence in it that I've programmed that will do this filtering, and it's gonna create a percussive kind of sound. It's a very easy way of adding percussive elements to a track. Now we're gonna open up the modulation panel here, and what we're gonna do now is go to the LFO sweep modulation, and we're gonna open this up and look for the sequencer phase from the MuRF. It's right there, we select that, and now we will be able to sweep the filters either up or down, depending on how we set this. Now, before we do anything, I want to change the envelope a bit so that it's not so percussive. That way you can really hear what's going on when we're sweeping the filter. And I also want to make sure that the LFO function is off so that we're only using the sequencer phase for the sweeping for the moment. This will allow us to hear what's going on when we're sweeping the filter. And if we wanted to add LFO to this, we could do that by turning the LFO on. So I'm going to turn it on, but I want to be able to control the amount of LFO we're getting. And to do that, we're going to use the LFO amount. And what we're going to do is we're going to turn it into a proper control knob by sending a DC signal to it.
When we do that, we're basically sending a constant signal. As you can see, it's lighting up and it's staying lit, turning this knob into a control knob. So now we can control the amount of LFO. And if we turn this back to a percussive sound, all right, so in this one, I am actually doing almost the same thing I did with the envelope modulation, only I'm using noise. So to activate the noise output, I have to activate its envelope. And I'm doing that again with another drum track. So this drum track here is activating the envelope for this noise. And then I can use that noise output to modulate stuff over here in the filter. And here, another drum track is running through it, and then I'm using the noise output to modulate the cutoff and resonance. And what I end up with is this. And just like with the envelope modulation, I can change the output of the noise by changing the rhythm in this drum track. So if we put them just over here, now, I just want to show you a neat way of turning an envelope signal into an LFO. You see, if you have a synthesizer running through a moogerfooger with an envelope, with basically a steady signal with a varying amplitude, such as this, for instance. It's basically just a signal being outputted going from a low volume to a high volume, a low amplitude to a higher amplitude. And when that's going through an envelope, it is raising or opening the envelope up when the amplitude gets higher, and it's closing it as it goes down. So something moving like this will basically turn the envelope into an LFO. So here I've added that signal to the cutoff knob in the MF-101 filter. And we can now control the speed of this too. Now, I hope this is helpful for those of you who might just have just a few moogerfoogers and maybe none of them have an LFO output. Now you know how to turn the envelope into an LFO output. All right, listen up. The MF-106TC, or time compression or time compressor, was an April Fool's joke. I thought, but what if it wasn't? You see, Moog said that it was too powerful because it would allow players to hear notes before they were played. Okay. Now, what would have the power to break causality like that? Well, I'll tell you what would have that. A warp drive. It has the capacity of flying faster than the speed of light. And when you've got something like that, you have a time machine. And with a time machine, you can break causality. So, you shouldn't build one. It's a bad idea. But I did anyway, in software form. Now mine is based around a singularity. I simulated the M87, 89, I can't remember the number sequence. It doesn't really matter, you know, technical details. But yeah, they took a picture of it a little while ago. Kind of looks like loopy. Well, I simulated it and put it into my pedal. And now that is bending space-time, and it's, you know what, the technical details really are fluff. It's not important. The problem here is that whenever I turn it on, weird things happen. I'm discovering music on my iPad I haven't made yet. And the thing is, when I listen to it, I'm not even sure that this version of me has made it yet. I've been standing too long in line. All I want is some fucking milk. So give me some milk. Give me some milk, motherfucker. Hey,
Alltså seriöst, vad fan är det för jävla skit?
It gets even worse because the video bit you're watching right now, I didn't make it yet. And how would I know that I haven't made it yet and still be able to talk about it?
Picture of Muo.
I hate temporal mechanics, and if you thought that any of this in this whole bit here was real, then I just don't know what to do for you. As final thoughts, I would say the moogerfoogers offer something that not many other plugins do. To get the closest to something like the moogerfooger, you would have to bring out something like this, or this. Yeah, basically modular synths. And you could probably put something awesome together in AUM with MIDI plugins and other effect plugins, but here it's all done for you. It would be a mistake not to get the entire suite, because at some point you are going to want to play around with the other stuff. And as I showed you in this video, there is a lot you can do with them. Unconventional stuff and conventional stuff. Do everything else you haven't done yet, because that's what modular is there for, to do the things that you didn't know you could make, to find out new things you didn't know that you liked. That's what the moogerfoogers are really, really good at. Plus, they can also do the regular stuff. So yeah, I mean, you're good anyway. I also want to give a huge shout out and a big thank you to Moog, who sponsored this video. Thank you for sponsoring a smaller channel on YouTube. It really means a lot. And also thank you for giving me a little bit more time to work with this video. I had some stuff happen in real life, and things just took way longer than it was supposed to. But they were patient and waited for me. So thank you for that, Moog, and thank you for sponsoring this video. To everyone else who have watched this far, first of all, you're insane, certifiably, but you are also amazing. Thank you for continuing supporting me like this. It really means a lot. And if you watched all of it, then you have no idea how much I love you. Yeah, and if you want to support me in any other ways, there are a bunch of links down there in the pinned comment. Also, together with links to the moogerfoogers, both on desktop and on iOS and all that good stuff. Just go down there, check it out, grab some foogers. As usual, I wish you a very productive week. Now go finger all of your stuff and have a lot of fun doing it.
I love you so much, oh moo. I love you so much, Mr. Pooh. I love you so much, oh moo, 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 Mr. Pooh. Do you love me too, moo? Do you love me too, Mr. Pooh? Do you love me too, moo? Can I be your Miss Pooh?